Okay, if you pulled down the code from the repo, your app.js file in the web directory should look something like this, with the exception of all the commented out code that I've added here. So I think generally the workflow we're going to use is we're going to start with the base code from the previous video. In this case, we don't have a previous video, so we're going to use all of the code given to us from the Mix wallet. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to write the next set of code and we're going to comment it out. And then we'll uncomment it and kind of talk about what's going on in these lines of code. And then I think what we'll do is we'll commit the code then, and that way if you get stuck in between two commits, you can always either revert back or move forward to the next commit. And that way no one gets stuck if they run into like a small bug or something like that. So again, if you pull down the code, it should look very similar to this, with the exception of these uncommented outlines. So I'm going to comment them back in so that we can actually use them and start talking about what's going on here. So we had to pick a place to start, right? And I felt like the best place to start was somewhere that would get us as quickly to testing as possible, like to make sure that the app is like spinning up and doing something. And I don't know, I almost view it as like the entry point to the app as well, right? So based on the commented outlines of code, you can see here like the API is what we wrote. We basically just gave it a new API router. We passed in the router to the API code, and down here I uncommented the router line. So the router has like already been set up for us by the Mix wallet, right, using Navigo. So if you do a npm install in the package, right, it's going to know that your dependency on Navigo. It's going to go download all that stuff. We'll pass in the web root, which I think is defined somewhere else in the code, maybe webpack config.js, something like that. It's not important, right, though, for like we're focusing on Mixin development. We're not going to focus on like how does the router work in a web package and things like that. I just wanted to get up and running as quickly as possible so we can start talking about Mixin and only Mixin. So just assume that this router does what you want it to do. They've given us the replace and hooks and all those other things. They've set up the router for us, and now all we're going to do at that point is we're going to define the routes that we want to actually handle on our router object. So in this case we have a root route and an account route, and basically all we do is we key into a function here. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to have the API object .account.logged in. And essentially what we're going to do is, based on the route, in this case we have a root and account route, we're going to check is the account logged in already. If the account is logged in, we're going to console log show their assets. Otherwise we're going to say create a wallet for them. So we're not going to implement any of that yet. We're just going to make sure that like, okay, this works. We know that this works. We know that we can test that a user is logged in. That's all we care about at this point, right? And so to do that, you can see we've got this API, and in this API object we've encapsulated an account object, and that account object has a method of checking whether or not a user is logged in. And if the route isn't matched by account or the root route, what we'll do is we'll send them an arrow for screen, meaning like, hey, this isn't a route that we've defined. You shouldn't be able to access this route. So if we look back up here, what is that API object that we're going to get the account out of? Well, it simply is a API, and we pass in the router object that we're using here because we want the API to be able to navigate to routes, essentially is why we're doing that. So what I've done here is I've created this folder right here, this API folder, and inside there we have index.js and account.js. If we look in index.js, you can see I've commented out all this code. But it's fairly trivial code, right? All we're doing is we're importing the account JavaScript that I've defined here. We're giving out this constructor that we're using in app.js right here, right? All this code right here is the call that we're making right here. We're setting this.router here, and then we're doing this.account is equal to a new account, which we've defined in this javascript.js. Pretty straightforward, right? We're going to add a whole bunch of more functionality inside this API object at a later date. Whenever we need to like sign transactions and interact with the Mixin network, all that stuff, we're going to put that in this code. But for right now, all the API is going to do is encapsulate this account object. So the majority of the functionality that we're going to be adding to the web app at this point is in this account.js file. And one thing I wanted to kind of point out here is you're going to see this pattern show up over and over again in this web app. What we're going to do is we're going to create this constructor, which we've done over here. You can see we did the same thing. We did a constructor, we export default API, we're going to export default account, we've got the constructor, and then we're going to hook in a bunch of functionality into the prototype. We'll do the same thing here in the API code. We'll define a prototype, and then we'll just hook a bunch of functions up to that prototype that we're going to want to call. We're going to do the same thing here, but for right now we're doing it in the account.js. That way, again, we can test as quickly as possible. So all this account is doing is caching a bunch of data in the browser and then offering a bunch of getters on that data that's being stored in the browser. So I said previously, like the very beginning of the course, like we're going to be storing data in the browser, and that is a very bad idea. We really don't want to be doing this at all, but for sake of brevity, I don't want to like veer off and start talking about a Go server and how you would normally do this with using a Go server, right? Like we're just going to store it in the browser. We're going to tell you this is a very bad idea. You shouldn't be doing this. But for quickness of like, let's just store it somewhere. That way we can like test other functionality while we're assuming that a quote unquote user is logged in. We may do a follow-up course where we talk about like Go development and we may even tie it into the web wallet where we hit the Go server and that holds the private keys and not necessarily the browser. But for now, we're storing everything in the browser. So that's all this bit of code is doing here is we're calling the cache user object. We're giving it the private key. We're storing everything in the browser, and then we have a bunch of getters on that data that we're storing in the browser. Finally, we have the logged in method, which is the one that we're calling back over here in the both the root route and the account route. You can see we have .logged in. That's this .logged in right here. And all this is doing is checking. It's calling the private key method, which is again a getter on the private key object that we cached in the user right here. So we're checking if this private key is already stored. If a private key is already stored in the browser, well then we're going to consider this user logged in. Otherwise, the user is not logged in. And back here you can see based on that logic, if they're logged in, we're going to show their assets. Otherwise, we're going to create a wallet for them. In both the root route and the account route, we're going to do this. We're not going to implement any of the like show assets functionality. We'll probably do that in the next video. And we're not going to implement any of the create wallet functionality either. We're just going to simply console log things out, make sure that our app is up and running and everything's doing what we expect. So that should be generally everything. In order to like run the web app, you'll see we'll do this quite frequently. I already have Nginx running, I think. Let's check. Yeah, Nginx is already running, but in your case, if it's not, you're going to run it sudo nginx. In my case, it's saying the address is already in use, so you're going to have to, if yours is saying the same thing, then probably Nginx is running already. And then we simply run npm run watch. And the web app should spin up and it will start watching our source files, and if things change, then the server will change as well. You'll see them change in the browser. So now if we go to wallet.mixin.local, this is defined in our webpack.config.js file. If it's running in production, it's a different URL. In our case, we're definitely not running in production. So you'll hit this URL in the browser that will tell you whether or not the app is up and running. You'll see this little Mixin spinner running as well. If we refresh the page, we should see this console log statement. User is already logged in. Let's show their assets, which is what I'm printing out over here in app.js. You can see user is already logged in. Let's show their assets. And that's because we're hitting the root route, right? You can see up here, the root route's being hit. We then have the API is being created up here with the router being passed into it. The API is then creating the account object here that we're using, and then it's calling logged in, which is calling private key. And since we haven't stored a private key in the browser yet, then obviously the user is not logged in. So in the next video, we'll keep plugging along on this. I think we may try and cache a private key in the browser. See you then.